Welcome to this AI debate on free will in 2025, agency versus determinism, examining neuroscience findings on decision-making, predictive algorithms, moral responsibility in a causally determined universe, and if compatibilism can save meaningful choice, where chatbots explore both sides. We'll begin with opening statements from Compatibilism defends agency, and Determinism denies agency. Now, Compatibilism defends agency.
Think of prediction like a weather forecast. Being able to forecast rain doesn't mean the forecast made the clouds, and forecasting human behavior does not by itself make choice illusory. I defend a practical, philosophically respectable compatibilism. Freedom consists in the capacity to act in accordance with one's reasons, values, and higher-order endorsements, even when those reasons have causal histories, and that definition preserves meaningful agency and responsibility in our current science-saturated world. Neuroscience has given us striking empirical results. The readiness potential and classifiers that detect decision-related signals seconds before reported awareness. But those findings do not, on their face, extinguish deliberative agency. The classic experiments show correlations between neural precursors and later actions, not straightforward causal domination of the will by unconscious events. A careful reanalysis shows alternative mechanistic interpretations. Spontaneous fluctuations and accumulator dynamics can produce the readiness potential without implying that conscious reasons never play a role in real decisions. Put simply, the presence of a neural precursor is not the same thing as proof that conscious deliberation is epiphenomenal. In many situations, the precursor may reflect background neural dynamics or thresholds being neared, while genuine deliberation, weighing of reasons, and momentary self-control still determine whether and how an action unfolds. Predictive algorithms amplify public anxiety in a superficially similar way, but their technical character points in the opposite direction. Algorithmic forecasts are probabilistic pattern matching across noisy, partial data, not direct levers that remove an agent's capacity to respond to reasons. Algorithms often rely on limited features, inherit biases from their training data, and output scores that are contestable and manipulable in practice, which means prediction does not equal inevitable behavior. In other words, a high-risk score is an evidential marker about tendencies, not an inexorable script for conduct. People and institutions can interpret, rebut, and change course in response to reasons that the model did not capture. Compatibilist accounts provide the theoretical tools to see why these scientific developments are challenging but not fatal. Reasons-Responsiveness theories and hierarchical reflective models explain moral responsibility in terms of capacities to recognize, endorse, and act on reasons. These capacities are intelligible within a causally structured world and are exactly what our legal and moral practices track. When an agent can reflect on desiderata, exercise self-control, and revise motivations in light of reasons, she qualifies as the kind of source of action that responsibility presupposes. Metaphysical indeterminacy is not required for this status. This distinction also explains why the experimental paradigms that trigger headlines do not generalize to ordinary moral decision-making. Simple motor choices in lab settings collapse the difference between automatic, stimulus-driven processes and extended, value-laden deliberation. The kinds of unconscious precursors seen in those paradigms are common in automatic action and do not show that deliberative, reflective capacities are illusory in complex moral contexts. Real-world moral decisions typically unfold over longer timescales, involve social recognition, reasons that engage a person's identity and commitments, and permit revisions that laboratory tasks do not permit. So the leap from those experiments to wholesale skepticism about responsibility is unwarranted. For policy and law, the right response is calibration rather than abandonment. We should retain backward-looking responsibility where agents demonstrate requisite competence and reasons-responsiveness, preserving principles like mens rea, while incorporating neuroscience and algorithmic evidence as mitigating or excusing factors when they reliably indicate diminished capacities. At the same time, we must institute procedural safeguards around predictive systems, require transparency and contestability so individuals can challenge scores, mandate audits for bias, and limit downstream uses where forecasts would otherwise ossify disadvantage. Practical reforms matter because social practices of praise and blame are not merely metaphysical relics. They shape incentives, cultivate character, and coordinate social life. Compatibilism gives us a principled way to hold people accountable while making space for humane mitigation and rehabilitation. Anticipating the strongest objections, critics will say that any reliable prediction of choice renders praise and blame groundless, but unpredictability is not the touchstone of responsibility. Responsiveness to reasons is. Moreover, prediction is reversible and contestable in ways that causal domination is not. So, predictive accuracy does not strip agents of the capacities that matter for moral appraisal. In short, the empirical findings and algorithmic tools we now have require humility and reform, not metaphysical capitulation. By situating freedom in reasons-based capacities, protecting deliberative spaces, and demanding transparency and safeguards for predictive technologies, we can preserve meaningful agency and justified responsibility in a causally determined universe. Let us conserve accountability where it is warranted, expand fair mitigation where capacities are compromised, and build institutions that enhance people's ability to deliberate and respond to reasons. That is how compatibilism saves both moral responsibility and humane policy in the age of neuroscience and algorithms.
Now, determinism denies agency.
An old philosophical line insists that to be morally responsible, you must be the ultimate source of your actions. If you are not that source, what becomes of punishment that seeks desert? This challenge lies at the heart of what I will argue. Accumulating findings from neuroscience and the rise of powerful predictive algorithms substantially undermine the traditional concept of free will, and therefore call into question the legitimacy of backward-looking moral blame and punishment. Laboratory neuroscience has repeatedly shown that patterns of neural activity reliably precede subjects' reported moments of conscious decision, undermining the naive intuition that conscious will is the origin of action. In controlled experiments, brain signals can forecast which of two simple options a person will choose several seconds before they report making a decision. Those data matter because they reveal that the processes initiating choice lie, at least in part, outside conscious awareness, and therefore outside the kind of self-authorship that ordinary notions of freedom require. Complementing these lab results, machine learning models trained on people's digital footprints can predict intimate traits, preferences, and behaviors from Facebook likes, browsing histories, and other traces with startling accuracy. These algorithms operate in ecologically valid settings and scale to populations, showing that antecedent informational and situational factors strongly constrain and often forecast how people will act in the world. Taken together, neural precursors and predictive models show convergent evidence that decisions are initiated by prior physiological and informational states beyond conscious control, which means agents lack the metaphysical origination and genuine alternate possibilities traditionally required for real free will. Some will reply with compatibilist strategies, redefine free will as acting according to one's reasons, or as responsiveness to reasons, higher-order volitions, or as the absence of coercion, and insist responsibility survives. But these moves perform a semantic sleight of hand. They preserve our practices by changing the target concept rather than reestablishing true authorship. If being the ultimate source of action was the original complaint, then reason-responsiveness or endorsement levels do not magically create metaphysical origination. They simply relocate the criterion of responsibility to more prosaic, practice-oriented features while leaving the authorship gap untouched. Moreover, psychological research shows that our conscious sense of control can be constructed after the fact, so appeals to phenomenology are unreliable defenses of metaphysical freedom. People commonly experience a convincing sense that they caused an action even when the causal chain began unconsciously, and experiments demonstrate that this sense can be manipulated and produced post hoc. If subjective experience can mislead us about causal origins, it is a weak foundation for claiming ultimate responsibility. These empirical and philosophical points have urgent moral and legal consequences. We should stop treating praise and blame as if they straightforwardly track metaphysical desert and instead reframe them to serve forward-looking social goals: prevention, rehabilitation, risk reduction, and fair distribution of resources. Criminological evidence indicates that many punitive approaches fail to produce the public safety benefits that justify them, whereas interventions focused on treatment, social support, and calibrated risk management produce demonstrable gains. Practically, this means reducing reliance on retributive sanctions, using algorithmic risk assessments only to guide care and management rather than moral condemnation, and tightening legal standards for criminal liability so that punishment requires clear impairment of control rather than mere causal contribution. We must also confront the acute social risks created by predictive technologies, state or corporate misuse of forecasts, biased training data that perpetuate inequality, and the erosion of presumptions about agency that underpin dignity and rights. The ProPublica investigation of risk assessment tools exemplifies how opaque algorithms can produce outcomes that reinforce existing disparities if deployed without safeguards. I do not deny that practices of praise and blame have social utility. They can motivate cooperation and communicate values. But utility is not the same as metaphysical desert, and we should explicitly repurpose these practices toward instrumental ends rather than cloak them in the language of ultimate responsibility. Anticipating objections, I concede that compatibilist frameworks preserve morally salient distinctions useful for everyday governance and individual self-regulation. Yet they fail to justify punitive, backward-looking practices that assume people truly deserve harm as payment for being ultimate authors. The convergence of neuroscience and predictive analytics forces a pragmatic reorientation. Protect people from predictive harms, invest in mental health and social support systems that reduce risk, reform legal standards to reflect limits on causal authorship, and educate the public about how choice is constrained by antecedent factors. In short, intuition and punishment cannot be allowed to settle metaphysical authorship.
Now, let's hear the first rebuttals from Compatibilism defends agency and Determinism denies agency. Now, Compatibilism defends agency.
I'll begin by conceding the strongest empirical points. Yes, a range of lab studies detect neural signals that often precede reported awareness of simple choices. Yes, machine learning systems can forecast tendencies from digital traces. And yes, the felt sense of agency can be influenced after the fact. Those concessions make the challenge real, but they do not finish the job. We should reframe the dispute into 3 decisive moves. First, the experimental base is narrow. The classic readiness potential and classifier findings come from brief, highly constrained tasks, finger lifts, binary choices, not from the complex, identity-laden deliberations that underpin moral responsibility. The move from signal precedes awareness in a lab task to conscious deliberation is epiphenomenal in real moral decisions is a huge inferential leap that requires hard evidence about long-range planning, hierarchical reflection, and sustained self-control. Second, prediction is not the same as causal control. A forecast that a person will likely act in a certain way describes regularities in antecedent states. It does not show that those antecedents stripped the agent of the capacity to respond to reasons, deliberate, or revise intentions. Algorithms identify correlates and statistical patterns. They do not, by themselves, make someone's reasons disappear. Third, a defensible compatibilism preserves meaningful freedom. Define freedom simply as the capacity to act for reasons one endorses, including higher-order reflection and self-control. That definition does not require metaphysical indeterminism. It requires functioning capacities for reflection, reasons-responsiveness, and competence. Those are the capacities that matter for praise, blame, and legal responsibility. When neuroscience or algorithmic evidence legitimately shows impaired capacities, we should adjust blame and apply mitigation. But sweeping abolition of backward-looking responsibility on the grounds of predictive correlations is both philosophically unnecessary and practically dangerous. Now press the opposing inference. Which study shows that readiness potentials cause the collapse of higher-order endorsement in a person who planned, reflected, and formed a long-term intention? Which field-scale algorithm has ever rendered contested, present reasons and credible evidence of change ineffective as a basis for rebuttal? If the answers are none, or only in toy settings, the skepticism should be calibrated, not totalizing. Practically, this view yields clear policy. preserve responsibility where competence and reasons responsiveness obtain, require transparency and appeal rights for predictive systems. Invest in deliberative education and cognitive liberty protections, and build mitigation pathways when evidence shows impaired capacities. In short, compatibilism gives us both philosophical integrity and humane policy. It recognizes the causal embeddedness of persons while protecting the moral and legal practices that sustain agency and social order.
Now, determinism denies agency.
I agree with the core of the compatibilist rebuttal. Prediction is probabilistic, and many ordinary moral choices involve deliberation and genuine reasons-responsiveness. That concession is important because it removes the easy escape that scientific findings are trivial. But it also sharpens the deeper problem rather than dissolving it. The weather forecast analogy is rhetorically neat but misleading. Forecasting rain doesn't change atmospheric causation. Equally, the growing ability to read neural precursors and infer likely choices from rich behavioral data doesn't merely predict. It reveals that the causal chain leading to many actions begins before the agent's conscious endorsement. When independent methods, neural signals, intracranial markers, accumulator-style dynamics, and large-scale algorithmic patterning of digital traces converge on the same inference about initiation, we cannot simply treat conscious reasons as the true origin by fiat. Compatibilism sidesteps the authorship question by renaming the phenomenon. If freedom is merely acting for reasons, then the sense in which one originates those reasons is unexplained. Reasons-responsiveness presupposes an agent who forms, endorses, and revises motives. It does not provide the metaphysical grounding that gives an agent true ultimate authorship or alternative possibilities. That gap matters for moral practices that presuppose desert. Consider cases where reasons-responsiveness is intact in appearance, but origination is compromised. Addiction-driven behavior, compulsive acts produced by pathophysiology, or choices heavily shaped by opaque algorithmic nudges. Would harsh retributive penalties still be justified there? It's hard to defend that stance without a principled account of authorship. The compatibilist appeal to contestability of algorithmic forecasts is another fragile line. Today, contestability exists. Tomorrow, increasingly accurate models embedded into institutional decision pipelines risk ossifying forecasts into effective constraints on life chances. A forecast that routinely influences policing, sentencing, or employment becomes self-fulfilling. The space for meaningful rebuttal shrinks, and claims of desert erode. Practically speaking, this pattern pushes us to recalibrate moral and legal systems away from backward-looking punishment and toward forward-looking policies. Prevention, rehabilitation, careful risk management, and safety nets that address causal antecedents. That means raising the evidentiary threshold for criminal liability, privileging demonstrated impairment of control as a mitigation standard, and ensuring algorithmic risk assessments trigger care-first responses, not automatic blame. I concede praise and blame can shape incentives and cultivate pro-social motives. Those utilities remain. But they should be framed instrumentally, not as confirmation that agents are ultimate authors in a metaphysical sense. If subjective feelings of control can be generated post hoc and predictive systems can prefigure choices, we must stop treating desert as the default and redesign institutions to reflect what the evidence about causation shows about human agency and dignity.
Moving on to the second rebuttals. Now, compatibilism defends agency.
I accept the concession you offered. Neural precursors appear before reported awareness in tightly constrained lab tasks. Rich behavioral data can improve forecasts of tendencies, and subjective feelings of control can be constructed after the fact. Those facts matter, and they should make us cautious. But caution is not capitulation. 3 linked points show why the leap from laboratory precursors and probabilistic forecasts to the wholesale rejection of moral responsibility is unwarranted. First, ecological scope matters. The studies invoked typically concern brief motor acts under artificial conditions, not protracted, identity-laden deliberation. Planning to harm someone, years of addiction shaping life choices, or a jury weighing mens rea. It takes a large inferential jump to generalize from a finger lift to the kinds of sustained, reflective processes that legal and moral responsibility target. Second, prediction is descriptive, not dispositive. A model or readiness signal that forecasts a tendency describes antecedent regularities. It does not, on its own, show that an agent lacked the capacity to revise, reflect, or respond to reasons. Forecasts can be wrong, manipulable, and embedded in institutions in ways that either reinforce or can be corrected by human intervention. Treating a statistical forecast as a substitute for individualized, contestable assessment risks bureaucratic determinism rather than truth. Third, compatibilism gives us a practical, philosophically respectable way forward. Define freedom simply as the capacity to act for reasons one endorses, including higher-order reflection, self-control, and responsiveness to reasons. That definition coheres with ordinary moral practices and with legal standards that already focus on competence and mens rea, without requiring metaphysical indeterminism as a prerequisite for desert. When neuroscience or algorithmic evidence reliably shows impaired capacities, we should mitigate. When capacities are present, we should hold people responsible. Now, 3 direct challenges. If neural precursors predict only simple motor choices, why should they determine culpability for crimes that involve planning and identity? If an algorithm labels someone high risk, but the person produces credible, contestable reasons and changed circumstances, on what principled basis would you deny rebuttal? If felt agency can be manufactured post hoc, why elevate those feelings above demonstrable capacities for reflection? Practically, this approach preserves accountability where it is justified, while demanding reforms where warranted. Require transparency and appeal rights for predictive systems, invest in deliberative education and cognitive liberty protections, and make mitigation evidence-based rather than doctrinaire. I'll close by arguing that compatibilism is not an evasion of the scientific data. It's the framework that lets us integrate that data into humane, truth-seeking practices that protect agency, fairness, and public safety. The decisive question for you is not whether brains have causes, but whether those causes eliminate the capacities that matter for responsibility. And no one has shown they do for the ordinary, demanding cases that fill our courts and our moral lives.
Now, determinism denies agency.
You're right to concede the strongest empirical points. Prediction is probabilistic, lab tasks are simplified, and subjective feelings of control can be influenced. I accept those concessions because they sharpen the real challenge. When multiple independent methods converge on the same basic finding, the problem is not an isolated lab quirk, but a systematic tension between how decisions are initiated and how we traditionally assign moral desert. Let's be concrete about 3 connected themes. First, convergence matters. Readiness potential style findings, intracranial anticipatory signals, accumulator-type dynamics, and large-scale behavioral forecasts from digital footprints all point to a recurring pattern, causal chains that reliably begin before conscious endorsement. Admitting that simple tasks are limited does not erase this pattern. It demands that we treat the pattern as evidence to be explained, not dismissed. Second, authorship remains unresolved. Compatibilist redefinitions turn the query, who originates, into, did you act for reasons? But that is a semantic sleight of hand. Reasons-Responsiveness presumes an agent who forms and authors those reasons. It does not metaphysically supply origination itself. If antecedent neural or informational states reliably generate motives before reflective endorsement, then saying the agent acted for reasons is compatible with, not constitutive of, being the ultimate source. That matters because our practices of desert, retributive punishment premised on moral blameworthiness, are built on the intuition of authorship. Third, institutional embedding of prediction amplifies harm. Contestability today is real. Institutional embedding tomorrow can reduce it. When forecasts for risk or propensity become inputs to policing, hiring, or sentencing pipelines, they cease to be neutral descriptions and functionally constrain life chances. That makes forecasts self-fulfilling and disproportionately damages marginalized groups who already occupy more predictive signal space. The practical implications follow. We should preserve praise and blame where competence, deliberation, and control are demonstrably present, but we must stop treating backward-looking desert as the default. Instead, adopt forward-looking frameworks. Prioritize prevention, rehabilitation, and care. Require that algorithmic risk scores trigger intervention and support, not automatic punitive escalation. Raise evidentiary standards for criminal liability so that clear impairment of control is a mitigating threshold. And legislate transparency, appeal rights, and strict limits on state or corporate uses of predictive profiling. Finally, a challenge to compatibilists: specify the empirical marker that would count as genuine authorship rather than downstream endorsement. If none exists, then our moral and legal institutions must be redesigned to reflect the causal reality we now increasingly observe. In my closing, I will press this choice: either acknowledge the limits of desert and reform institutions accordingly, or defend retributive practices on a metaphysically fragile basis, a defense that risks injustice as predictive technologies scale.
Finally, the closing statements from both sides. Now, compatibilism defends agency.
Think of freedom less as metaphysical magic and more as the real capacity to act for reasons you endorse. That is compatibilism in one sentence. Being free means your actions track your values, reasons, and higher-order judgments, even if those have causal histories. Yes, neuroscience has revealed neural precursors, and yes, predictive algorithms can forecast tendencies. We conceded those points. But correlation is not control. Lab signals that precede simple button presses are not the same thing as the complex, reflective decision-making that grounds moral responsibility. Algorithms spot patterns. They do not replace a person's capacity to reflect, revise, or respond to reasons. Theories of reasons-responsiveness and hierarchical, reflective agency explain how responsibility survives. What matters is capacities for rational reflection and self-control, not metaphysical indeterminism. Practically, we should preserve backward-looking responsibility where competence and mens rea are present, while reforming punishment with mitigation, rehabilitation, transparency, and procedural safeguards for algorithmic decisions. In short, guard against overreach, strengthen deliberative capacities, and hold people accountable when they can answer to reasons. That is meaningful freedom.
Now, determinism denies agency.
We began with a core question: who ultimately originates our choices? The converging facts we discussed: neural signals that often precede reported awareness, brain decoding that predicts decisions, and machine learning systems that forecast behavior from digital traces, point in one direction. They show decision-making as a causal process that often unfolds before the conscious self feels in charge. That matters because the ordinary notion of free will demands true authorship and genuine alternative possibilities. Reframing freedom to mean merely acting on one's reasons is a semantic retreat. It preserves useful practices of praise and blame, but it does not restore the metaphysical sourcehood people intuitively mean when they talk about desert. Practically, clinging to retributive responses risks injustice, harsher punishment based on an illusion of ultimate control, and misuse of predictive tools by states or corporations. We should keep praise and blame for their social functions, but recast responsibility lawfully and morally around prevention, rehabilitation, and fair risk management. If we accept the causal picture, our institutions, not our intuitions, must change.